Erich Kempka was one of those silent witnesses who are easily forgotten or overlooked in history books. A mechanic from a working-class background, he found in his trade as a driver the gateway to Hitler's innermost circle. From the front seat he observed how a provincial agitator transformed into a head of state, and how that seemingly indestructible power crumbled in the basements of the Chancellery. What began as a routine job pulled him into pivotal scenes, from endless campaign trips to the final days in the bunker. There his role took on a darker shade. He was one of those tasked with assisting in the incineration of Hitler and Eva Braun's remains, fulfilling the Führer's final directive. This documentary recovers the memory of a driver who, without seeking prominence, ended up as a privileged witness to the grandeur, ruin, and epilogue of the Third Reich. Face-to-face with Hitler, the decisive technical and personal test. Erich Kempka was born in 1910 in Oberhausen, an industrial city in the Ruhr. His childhood unfolded in a large Polish origin family, marked by modesty and the discipline of a working-class home. From an early age, he showed an inclination for the world of motors, a budding passion in an era when the automobile was beginning to transform daily life. He completed his apprenticeship at the DKW vehicle dealership in Essen and later secured a job as a driver for a local newspaper. Unbeknownst to him, that trade would open the path to the closest circles of power in the Germany yet to come. On the 1st of April, 1930, he joined the National Socialist Party, becoming member number 225,639. He was soon appointed driver for the regional leader in Essen, Josef Terboven, which placed him within the party's structure. His life seemed to progress without major upheavals until, in February 1932, he received an unexpected telegram. In a few lines, it ordered him to present himself the following day at Hitler's private chancellery in the Kaiserhof Hotel in Berlin. The news deeply surprised him, and during the train journey, he couldn't stop wondering what reason had brought him there. The trip was long and tedious. In a third-class carriage surrounded by strangers, he mentally reviewed every possible mistake from his past. But finding no fault, he allowed himself to dream of the possibility that the message heralded a favorable turn in his fate. Upon arriving in the capital, he was struck by the city's magnitude, the bustle of the station, the solemnity of Wilhelmplatz, and above all the imposing facade of the Kaiserhof Hotel, by then a meeting point for the political elite. Inside the hotel, he discovered he was not alone. Some 30 men, also summoned by telegram from various regions, awaited instructions. He soon realized they all shared the same trade. They were drivers for prominent party figures. That gathering had to have a purpose of great importance. The atmosphere was charged with nervousness, but also ambition. Each man silently aspired to secure the position at stake. When they were finally called, they found themselves face to face with Hitler himself. Under the supervision of his aide, Wilhelm Brückner, they formed a semicircle. Kempka, the shortest in stature, stood at the left end. The interview proceeded with technical and personal questions, revealing the leader's surprising mechanical knowledge. When his turn came, Kempka answered swiftly about engines, maneuvers, and risky situations. The intensity of the questioning caught him off guard, but he managed to satisfy his interlocutor. Hitler's gesture of shaking his hand was enough for Kempka to understand he had made a good impression. No result was announced that day. The candidates received a nominal payment for expenses and were dismissed, left in uncertainty. However, the encounter left an indelible mark on Kempka. The feeling of having stood before someone who, for better or worse, was destined to shape German history. Back in Essen, he still doubted his luck. A few days later, a second telegram dispelled any hesitation. He was to present himself in Munich before Rudolf Hess. He had been chosen to accompany and drive the man everyone was talking about, Adolf Hitler. Upon receiving the summons to appear in Munich, Kempka embarked on the journey with the uncertainty typical of a young man just beginning to grasp the magnitude of the task awaiting him. His destination was the Daimler-Benz headquarters on Dachauer Strasse, where he was to report without delay. There, Julius Schreck, Hitler's personal driver and confidant, awaited him and received him warmly. From their first meeting, Schreck wanted to test him. He asked if Kempka had ever driven a 6-liter Mercedes compressor. When Kempka replied no, Schreck led him to a garage and showed him an imposing open-body car with a large engine. Kempka, impressed, had never seen anything like it. Due to his height, makeshift adjustments were made to the seat to ensure visibility at the wheel. After checking oil and water levels, he maneuvered the vehicle outside and set off. With Schreck and other team members on board, he drove to Berlin, where he met Hitler again. This time the conversation took a more personal tone. The leader wanted to know details about his family, education, and work life. During that talk, a bond of trust was forged that over time would define their relationship. The presidential election campaign for the Reich soon began. Kempka was assigned to the guest car, covering thousands of kilometers day and night. The pace was relentless. Punctual arrivals in towns and cities, speeches to crowds, and immediate departures to the next destination. Hitler himself took charge of calculating routes and schedules, always with a map on his lap, while holding brief conversations with the drivers and even preparing snacks to help them endure the fatigue on the road. During these journeys, Kempka observed with some envy the closeness Schreck maintained with his boss, though soon he too would have opportunities to accompany the leader. On one occasion, when Schreck fell ill with food poisoning, Hermann Göring took his place at the wheel. However, Hitler ordered Kempka to familiarize himself with the vehicle and drive it during a nighttime stretch to Landsberg an der Warthe. That trip confirmed he was no longer a mere apprentice. After the campaign, which covered more than 12,000 kilometers, Schreck confessed that the journey had actually been a trial period. Hitler, satisfied with his performance, decided to permanently include him in his inner circle of trust. During that year, Kempka gained unparalleled experience. He crossed Germany from north to south, logging over 100,000 kilometers. Though they rarely spoke of politics, Hitler treated him with a close, almost paternal demeanor, insisting that drivers and pilots were the men he trusted most as he placed his life in their hands. As the campaigns intensified, German territory was divided. Schreck handled the northwest, while Kempka took the rest, increasing his prominence. On the 16th of May, 1936, he received unexpected news. Upon arriving at Hitler's apartment in Munich, he found him devastated. Schreck had died suddenly from fulminant meningitis. Kempka was immediately appointed his successor and named head of the Führer's automobile unit with the rank of Sturmbahnführer in the SS. For a young man, this was an enormous responsibility. Organizing workshops, expanding garages, supervising mechanics, and maintaining constant communication about the condition of each vehicle. In performing these duties, Kempka was also the one who, despite Hitler's initial refusal, pushed for the creation of an armored car. After the failed assassination attempt at the Munich beer hall in 1939, he managed to convince him of its necessity. The vehicle, reinforced with steel plates and extraordinarily thick glass, was incorporated into the Führer's regular use. From then on, the construction of more units was ordered, some of which Kempka personally delivered as diplomatic gifts. Among the recipients of these cars were leaders such as Marshal Mannerheim in Finland, Ion Antonescu in Romania, and Boris III in Bulgaria. Each delivery was surrounded by a ceremony that strengthened the political ties of Nazi Germany with its allies and satellites. Kempka, who had started as a newspaper driver in Essen, now found himself traveling across Europe as the dictator's personal envoy, witnessing scenes that blended technological fascination with the diplomacy of those years. The fall of Hesse and the consolidation of Bormann's power. Erich Kempka's appointment as Hitler's personal driver not only brought him closer to the nerve centers of Berlin and Munich, but also led him to an unexpected setting, the Obersalzberg. His first contact with the place during Easter of 1932 felt more like a rudimentary retreat than a hub of power. After snowfalls, the ascent required dragging luggage on sleds along narrow paths, and the house that welcomed visitors, called Haus Wachenfeld, was nothing more than a modest rustic structure. It barely had space for a few guests. The rest had to stay in nearby inns. Even so, Kempka would recall the serenity conveyed by the alpine landscape and the warmth with which Angela Raubel, Hitler's half-sister, welcomed those who arrived. In that simple setting, the future dictator found a peace that contrasted with the political agitation of the cities. The growing sales of Mein Kampf enabled the purchase and renovation of the property, which soon transformed into the Berghof. For Kempka, witnessing the metamorphosis of that house into an elegant building was also a tangible reflection of his boss's meteoric rise. In just a few years, what had been an isolated refuge became a stage for receiving monarchs, diplomats, and foreign ministers. Hitler, as he himself expressed, saw that residence as his true home, a space that combined rest and politics. Days of mountain excursions alternated with state meetings, and that duality became an essential part of life there. The arrival of Martin Bormann in the mid-1930s profoundly altered the balance of the place. Until then, a minor official under Rudolf Hess, he found in the Obersalzberg the opportunity to unleash his ambition. Through the systematic purchase of land from local farmers, often at prices far above their value, he wove a belt of properties around the Berghof. In a short time, much of the area came under the party's control thanks to his maneuvers. That operation, which meant displacement for the locals, became the foundation of Bormann's power. Kempka observed how Bormann cultivated an image of a tireless worker. He often requested to be included in meals only to excuse himself later, citing an excess of duties, thereby reinforcing the idea of his indispensability. When he finally appeared, he did so late, calculating every gesture to underscore his absolute dedication. Hitler interpreted these behaviors as proof of efficiency and soon entrusted him with the administration of the Berghof. From that position, Bormann sidelined rivals and subjected the staff to his authority, in a process that, to those living there, turned the residence into a territory under his personal dominion. His way of wielding power oscillated between generosity and sudden humiliation, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. Kempka recalled how many employees, bewildered, concluded that this capricious behavior was, in fact, a calculated method to enforce obedience. On more than one occasion, seemingly trivial gestures became examples of his ability to execute orders swiftly. It was enough for Hitler to complain about a farm visible from the terrace for Bormann to have it removed in a single day and replaced with a meadow. On another occasion, after hearing the Führer lament the heat of the sun during greetings, Bormann immediately planted a large tree in the exact spot where he usually stood. These were demonstrations of efficiency that solidified his position. Over time, Bormann turned access to Hitler into a controlled privilege. No visitor could present themselves without his approval, and in cases where he couldn't prevent a meeting, he ensured he was present to steer the conversation. Ministers and generals privately complained about this interference, but the filter became unavoidable. Kempka understood that this constant vigilance was not just about loyalty, but also a cold calculation to become an indispensable mediator. According to Kempka, after Rudolf Hess's flight to Britain in 1941, Bormann's power was cemented. Hitler reacted with bewilderment and fury, calling the act madness, while Bormann seized the opportunity to take his place and reorganize the party chancellery. He ordered all mentions of Hess erased from documents and portraits, and even banned the utterance of his name. For those working on the mountain, the message was clear: he would tolerate no competitors. Meanwhile, daily life at the Berghof took on a dual character. The retreat transformed into a political headquarters at the same time. Kempka witnessed how Eva Braun's arrival accentuated this blend of intimacy and power. She, whom he knew from the days at Hoffmann's photography studio, began to settle in more permanently from 1936. Her presence brought a domestic air. She organized evenings, attended to household details, and played with the children of close friends. For Kempka, this contrast with the solemn receptions offered a less rigid image of the place. Amid uniforms and protocols, Braun's presence symbolized a breath of everyday life. Security at Obersalzberg was handled by the Reich Protection Service under Himmler's control. Many of its men were not even party militants, but the discipline was relentless. During each state visit, Waffen-SS units deployed strict ceremonial protocols, reminding everyone that despite its retreat-like appearance, The space functioned as a government center. Kempka experienced it as a routine where the familiarity of the mountains coexisted with military severity. Another figure who began frequenting the Berghof was Dr. Theodor Morell. Kempka met him as a clumsy, inelegant man, even careless in his manners. Yet, he knew Hitler had adopted him as a trusted physician after Morell restored his voice during an election campaign when other specialists had given up on his recovery. From then on, vitamin and glucose injections became part of daily life. Most saw him as an intruder, but Hitler granted him a privileged place. This contradiction became an inseparable part of the mountain routine. The mocked doctor simultaneously transformed into an indispensable advisor. Over the years, the Berghof became a symbol. It was the stage where the leader received foreign visitors under strict security measures, but also the place where he showed a more everyday side. Kempka could observe how the man who presented himself to the world with fiery speeches relaxed by strolling along the paths, conversing during meals, or silently contemplating the alpine landscape. For Kempka, this coexistence of grandeur and simplicity defined the retreat's atmosphere. However, Bormann's increasingly stifling presence altered the initial spirit. What had seemed an almost familial environment in the early years turned into a rigid space where every word and gesture was scrutinized. The driver, who had witnessed the architectural and political evolution of the place, also perceived the human transformation occurring there, from a close and relaxed circle to an environment of surveillance and calculation. This transition revealed that the Berghof was no longer just a mountain residence, but a monitored power center, where decisions extended far beyond the walls that housed them. Behind the Reich's windshield, Kempka in the early war days. The atmosphere at the Berghof, increasingly controlled by Bormann, contrasted with the accelerated pace of foreign policy. By late 1938, Hitler was amassing diplomatic and territorial victories that bolstered his confidence. The incorporation of the Saar Basin, Austria, and the Sudetenland had solidified expansion without firing a shot. For Kempka, that confidence was reflected in the journeys that took him to decisive settings, where the automobile became an extension of power. On the 15th of March, 1939, Erich Kempka received the order to prepare a convoy to the Czech border. Meanwhile, he personally drove President Hácha from the station to the new Reich Chancellery. Kempka recalled the tension of that day, during which the exhausted Czech leader fainted and had to be assisted by Morell. Hours later, Hitler departed on his special train toward the border. There, in the midst of a blizzard, Kempka took the wheel of an off-road vehicle with the Führer by his side, leading the caravan that slowly advanced toward Prague. The passage through customs was almost ceremonial. The barriers were raised without resistance, and the small column crossed the country unopposed. In Kempka's eyes, the paradox was evident. The occupation of the Czech capital had been accomplished with a small group of escorts and an improvised battalion, so poorly armed that it had to receive pistols from Hitler's personal guard. That precariousness led him to reflect years later on how easily they could have been stopped at that moment. The war brought new scenarios. Kempka accompanied Hitler on countless trips, by train, plane, or car. He particularly remembered the visit to Zaporozhye in the winter of 1942, when the Soviets threatened the Donbass region. Despite the general's warnings, Hitler insisted on staying there for several days at an airfield located a short distance from the front line. Only when the western airport was attacked by Soviet fighters did he agree to withdraw. For Kempka, that episode disproved the accusations of cowardice that would later circulate about him. The routine at the headquarters was monotonous, with endless workdays. Hitler demanded that everyone spend time in combat units to earn the recognition of being proven at the front, but Kempka was never allowed to do so. The Führer repeatedly told him that his role was irreplaceable, even in the most critical moments. The routine at the headquarters gradually faded as the war turned against Germany. Kempka returned in January 1945 from his father's funeral and found a heavy atmosphere of pessimism in Ziegenberg. The failure of the latest offensives, cities reduced to ruins by Allied bombings, and the inability to sustain weapons production made it clear that the country was exhausted. According to his recollections, he was surprised to learn that Hitler's headquarters would be relocated to Berlin, a decision many expected to be fulfilled in southern Germany, where preparations had been made for the final phase of the conflict. The journey to the capital was made in haste. Archives, communication equipment, and convoys headed north while Hitler traveled on his special train. Kempka, still affected by his family loss, drove at night to Berlin to await the convoy's arrival in Grunewald. There, upon seeing Hitler disembark, he was struck by how aged he appeared, marked by the fatigue of a journey that, nonetheless, had been made on a train equipped with the most modern communication technologies. That was the last time he would use that mode of transport. At the Chancellery, the sudden relocation had caused evident disarray. No one was prepared to receive the entourage, and the intact rooms had to be quickly adapted to house offices, bedrooms, and command centers. The underground spaces, expanded after the bombings, were filled with teletypes and maps, while new communication lines with Zossen and other command posts were improvised. Kempka had to undertake liaison trips to these centers, a task increasingly dangerous due to the proximity of the front. The tension was palpable. The Red Army was just a few kilometers away, awaiting the order to launch the final assault. Driving officers and generals along exposed routes, Kempka and his men worked day and night without rest. In addition to their usual duties, they were forced to assist in civil defense tasks, helping firefighting brigades during air raids. Despite the fatigue and psychological pressure, he heard no complaints from his drivers. They all knew the end was near. The daily tension in the bunker intensified as the war approached its conclusion. The appointment of Kesselring as commander on the Western Front turned the former Ziegenberg headquarters into his base, requiring constant trips between Berlin and Bad Nauheim. Kempka, aware of the risks, personally took on the responsibility of driving him on those journeys along roads covered with craters and the remains of vehicles destroyed by air attacks. They were, in his own words, the most dangerous trips he had ever made in his life. In March 1945, Hitler made the surprising decision to visit an advanced position in Frankfurt an der Oder. His aides tried to dissuade him, but he insisted on assessing the situation himself. During the journey, Kempka observed how the crowd received him with a mix of hope and astonishment. Women, soldiers, and children gathered to see him, as if his presence could alter the course of the war. It was the last time Kempka drove him seated by his side in a car. From then on, Hitler would remain confined underground. The pace of the days offered no respite. Barely back in Berlin, Kempka was summoned to accompany Albert Speer on an inspection of several sectors of the Western Front. The mission, begun in the early hours of the 19th of March, coincided with the minister's birthday. The trip, which lasted 5 days, took place under extreme conditions. Dark roads, vehicles camouflaged with mud, constant bombings and low-altitude air attacks. For Kempka, the tension of braking, diving into ditches, and returning to the road in a matter of seconds became a survival routine. The return to Berlin led him straight to the anteroom of the conference hall. There, amidst the incessant ringing of teletypes and telephones, he sensed an atmosphere as tense as it was silent. When Hitler emerged from the meeting, he approached Kempka and embraced him with gratitude for bringing Speer back safe and sound. The gesture was a direct blow to Bormann's attempts to sideline him, as Kempka still enjoyed the leader's personal trust, something that made him an object of resentment within the inner circle. On the 20th of April 1945, Hitler's birthday, the atmosphere in the bunker reflected the imminence of disaster. There were no parades or mass celebrations, only a stream of official visitors. At midnight, when Soviet artillery began pounding central Berlin, Kempka himself realized the final act had begun. In that climate of collapse, the departure of Dr. Morell left an immediate void in the role of Hitler's personal physician, nominally filled by Ludwig Stumpfegger, though in practice he never attended him. During that transition, the atmosphere in the bunker grew even more oppressive when Walter Huell, Ribbentrop's representative, shared with those present a document found on a Soviet prisoner. It was a pamphlet written by Ilya Ehrenberg, infamous for his fierce calls against the Germans. The text was clear. It urged the Red Army to show no mercy and to destroy everything in its path without pity. Those words, laden with hatred and vengeance, echoed in the room like a definitive sentence. Kempka would recall the immediate reaction: tense faces, vacant stares, and a silence that spoke louder than any words. Outside those walls, the pressure of the Soviet encirclement did not prevent Berlin from still showing signs of life. Amidst artillery and bombings, trams and trains continued to run where tracks and power remained. Entire factories even maintained production under the bombs. For Kempka, this daily stubbornness of the population held the same value as armed defense, a final gesture of resistance against an outcome that now seemed inevitable. Goebbels decided to stay with his family in Berlin, occupying the rooms previously used by Morell, while his children were taken to the old shelter. The attacks relentlessly damaged the Chancellery. Severed cables, collapsed walls, and blocked corridors complicated communications. Kempka felt these losses personally when, in the early hours of the 24th of April, a bombardment destroyed much of his vehicle fleet. More than 60 automobiles were buried under concrete, a blow that drastically reduced his mobility at the most critical moment. The tension heightened with Speer's unexpected arrival on the 25th. He had left Berlin as a final farewell, but returned in a small plane that landed on the avenue itself to meet with Hitler again. After the meeting, Speer spoke with Ribbentrop, urging him to abandon the capital. A few hours later, the foreign minister began his escape to the north. That same day, a telegram from Göring hit the inner circle like a bomb. It invoked the succession decree to claim power in case of Hitler's incapacity. For those still in the bunker, including Kempka, that message sounded like betrayal at the war's darkest moment. The hour to burn, Hitler, Kempka and the fire of the end. Amid the collapse, Eva Braun's presence in Berlin introduced a different note. She had arrived weeks earlier, against Hitler's wishes, and remained there during his birthday and the days that followed. Kempka recalled her serenity as she firmly declared to him that she would not abandon him under any circumstances. That decision, made calmly and without dramatics, reflected that for her, the Führer's fate was already sealed with her own. In a more personal conversation, Eva confided to Kempka that Hitler had clearly seen Bormann's true character, though the war had kept him in his post. To Kempka, this comment was revealing. It showed that even in that rigid circle, unresolvable internal tensions were acknowledged. Life under the Chancellery's concrete grew harsher each day. The ceiling withstood some direct hits, but the roar of Soviet artillery came through clearly. On the streets, resistance was barely sustained by Volkssturm and exhausted soldiers, unable to halt the advance of far better equipped armies. In the bunker's corridors, the wounded arriving from the city bore witness to increasingly desperate battles. Kempka occasionally accompanied Dr. Haase on his rounds through makeshift hospitals set up in underground facilities, and those images remained etched as a constant reminder of the disaster's magnitude. On the 26th of April, an unexpected scene disrupted the routine. General Ritter von Greim, newly appointed Luftwaffe chief, arrived wounded after a daring flight made possible by Hanna Reich's skill. For Kempka, the contrast between the pilot's toughness in the cockpit and the tenderness with which she entertained Goebbels' children hours later was unforgettable. It was as if, in the heart of the collapse, a fleeting humanity could still emerge. But that same night, the apparent calm shattered. Fegelein, Eva Braun's brother-in-law and Himmler's liaison, asked Kempka to safeguard a briefcase with confidential documents. He presented it as a simple security measure, though the truth soon emerged otherwise. Shortly after, Fegelein vanished into central Berlin, and the assigned vehicles returned without him. Minutes later, the bunker was thrown into pure commotion. A transmission confirmed that Himmler had initiated secret contacts with Count Bernadotte to negotiate with the Western Allies. The news of Himmler's contacts with the Allies struck like a bolt of lightning in the innermost circle. For Kempka, it was even more shocking than Göring's telegram. He recalled seeing Bormann storm out of the room, the crumpled message in his hand, furious, and immediately hurling a question that laid bare the general distrust. Where was Fegelein? The suspicion was shared by all, as if anyone could have been privy to that maneuver. It was him. Kempka then remembered his last encounter with the general and the detail of the briefcase Fegelein had promised to deliver that same night, never imagining that this seemingly trivial reference could end up implicating him as well. Tension grew within the bunker's walls. Men and women tried to stay calm, but anxiety was palpable. Kempka recalled how some secretaries, and even Huell, requested poison from Hitler, knowing they could fall into enemy hands at any moment. The shadow of betrayal had shattered the group's fragile discipline. The circle tightened further when Fegelein's aide was detained by the security guard. His statements confirmed that the general had changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes at his apartment and planned to hide until the Soviets advanced, intending to later join Himmler. To everyone, it was desertion. Soon after, Fegelein himself was intercepted in a deplorable state, bootless, wearing a coat and hat, trying to blend in among the refugees crowding the basements. Taken into custody, incriminating documents were found in his luggage, along with gold bars and foreign currency. For Kempka, who had treated him as a close comrade, the scene was hard to process. Hitler ordered an immediate trial. Though he hesitated to commute the sentence due to Eva Braun's family ties, he ultimately signed the condemnation. Kempka himself witnessed the coldness with which Fegelein heard his sentence before being executed in the garden of the Foreign Ministry. That same day, Hitler ordered a test of the poison provided earlier by Himmler. He chose his dog Blondie as the victim, a gesture Kempka interpreted as confirmation of his absolute distrust of everyone. The animal died instantly, dispelling any doubts about the capsule's effectiveness. Outside, Berlin burned in street fighting, while inside the bunker, preparations were already underway for the weddings and testaments that would seal the regime's final acts. The secret bond between Hitler and Eva Braun became public in the early hours of April 29th. In an improvised room in the bunker, surrounded by chosen witnesses, they formalized a marriage that came too late to change anything. The sound of explosions accompanied the ceremony, but those present recalled an almost intimate atmosphere, marked by the calm with which the couple signed the register. Kempka emphasizes that despite the immediacy of the catastrophe, Hitler wanted to ensure that the woman who had stood by him for years would not be remembered in history as merely a mistress. For him, that union was also an act of respect toward Eva, whose role had always remained in the shadows. After the signing, the gathering turned into a brief after-dinner moment. Amid light conversation and shared memories, they tried, if only for a few hours, to recreate a lost sense of normalcy. News of the marriage spread slowly. Most Germans didn't even know Eva Braun's name. Inside the bunker, however, everyone understood the gesture's weight. It was the symbolic closure of a life shared in private and confirmation that the end was near. At dawn, Hitler summoned Bormann and Goebbels to define the future structure of the Reich. He offered Goebbels the chancellorship, while the presidency was to fall to Dönitz, absent from Berlin. The attempt to persuade Goebbels to leave with his family sparked a dramatic scene. The minister, convinced he must stay in the city as defense commissioner, refused to abandon the bunker. The verbal confrontation with Hitler was intense, ending in tears of rage and mutual reproaches. Shortly after, Goebbels dictated his testament to Traudl-Junge, closing another chapter of unwavering loyalty that, however, could no longer alter their shared fate. That same day, Kempka was summoned once more to Hitler's presence. He found him calm, dressed in his campaign uniform, a map in one hand and a slight tremor in the other. Hitler asked about the morale of his drivers and received the expected reply: all were awaiting Wenck's arrival. "We're all waiting for Wenck," Hitler responded before shaking his hand for the last time. That night, as the Soviets consolidated control over the Reichstag, Hitler and Goebbels' testaments were signed, and messengers set out on desperate missions to deliver them beyond the encirclement. The day the Reich ended and Kempka's escape began. By noon on April 30, 1945, artillery impacts shook the Chancellery's walls. Outside, everything was in ruins, and inside, the atmosphere was stretched to its limit. Hitler shared a final lunch with his secretaries and Eva Braun, trying to maintain a cordial tone that barely concealed the imminence of the end. After bidding farewell to each with a gesture of gratitude, he retired with his wife to their private quarters, and that forced calm became confirmation that the end was moments away. Meanwhile, in the underground garages, Kempka answered a call from Otto Günsche. First, he requested a bottle of liquor, but soon called back with an urgent tone. He needed 200 litres of fuel. Kempka tried to excuse himself, aware of how difficult it was to gather that amount under those conditions, but the insistence revealed that something definitive had happened. When he arrived at the bunker, Günsche greeted him, pale and speechless, merely mimicking a gunshot with his hand before uttering the phrase that sealed everyone's fate. "The boss is dead." Hitler had taken his life in his study with a shot to the temple, while Eva Braun, seated on the sofa, had ingested poison. The first to enter were Bormann, Ling and Günsche himself, followed by Stumpfegger, who confirmed the deaths. Immediately, Ling went in search of the fuel Kempka had managed to collect from disabled vehicles. The canisters awaited by the shelter's exit, ready to fulfill Hitler's final wish, to prevent his body from falling into enemy hands and becoming a trophy. Kempka, still in disbelief, watched as the inner circle prepared to carry out that final order. In a Berlin reduced to ashes, the news of the dictator's death remained confined within the bunker's walls, like a secret impossible to keep for long. Minutes later, the scene took on an unrepeatable character. Linger and Stumpfegger emerged from the study carrying Hitler's body, covered by a blanket that hid his face. His left arm hung limp, revealing a paleness that confirmed the inevitable. Behind them came Bormann, carrying Eva Braun in his arms, dressed in black with her head tilted back. For Kempka, it was unbearable to see that man, whom Eva had despised in life, now carrying her to the pyre. Without thinking, he took the young woman from Bormann's arms and, with Günsche's help, carried her outside. The steps leading to the exit seemed endless under the weight of a lifeless body. With each nearby explosion, the air filled with dust and metal fragments. In the garden, the bodies were placed next to a depression formed by unfinished construction at the Chancellery. There, under a rain of projectiles, Kempka began to carry out the order he had received hours earlier: prepare the fuel for the incineration. Each trip to the bunker's entrance was a brush with death. The makeshift canisters were emptied over the bodies as the ground trembled under Soviet artillery. A moral dilemma pierced those involved in the task. Kempka himself admitted he kept telling himself he couldn't do it, yet the voice of discipline pushed him to continue. Eva's dress, stirred by the wind, soaked up the flammable liquid, and the faces of Günsche and Linger reflected the same inner struggle to obey. The idea of using a grenade to ignite the flames was discarded. Instead, a piece of cloth soaked in gasoline became an improvised torch. Goebbels, present at the scene, provided the matches to light the cloth. A spark was enough. A flame shot up quickly, followed by thick smoke that blended with the general inferno of the capital. The few present, Bormann, Goebbels, Linger, Stumpfegger and Kempka, watched in silence before raising a final salute to the couple burning before them. The flames slowly consumed what remained, and the bombardment prevented a continuous fire. For hours, amid forced pauses, more liters of fuel were poured over the remains in a desperate attempt to fulfill the last instruction received. After the incineration, life in the bunker continued with an unreal air, as if time itself had fragmented. In the conference room, Goebbels, Bormann, Berghof, Krebs and Mohnke gathered to decide the next steps. The task of negotiating with Zhukov fell to Krebs, who left amid the constant roar of cannons. He returned hours later, exhausted, with a response that sealed everyone's fate. The Soviets would accept only total surrender. With that, a breakout plan was outlined for the following night, though all knew the chances of crossing enemy lines were slim. The 1st of May dawned with a heavy silence that contrasted with the violence outside. Amid that tense calm, Goebbels requested more fuel be gathered. The decision to follow Hitler and his wife's example had been made, and preparations mixed with the final attempts to organize the escape. Kempka, a close witness, couldn't shake the image of Magda Goebbels and her 6 children still wandering the bunker's corridors. Soon after, it was learned that the children had been poisoned. Their parents' resolve to not surrender them alive to the Soviets had prevailed. The day also brought unexpected moments, almost detached from the disaster. In the makeshift hospital at the Chancellery, a gravely wounded young woman was admitted. Barely able to speak, she asked to see her fiancé, one of the unit's drivers. Kempka arranged for them to meet, and from that encounter arose an unusual wish: to marry amid the collapse. When Naumann, preoccupied with his duties, refused to officiate, Kempka conducted the ceremony. The couple exchanged vows as nearby explosions shook the walls, as if the intimacy of that act defied the surrounding ruin. The final hours in the bunker became a succession of extreme actions. Some sought to escape, others ensured the destruction of documents, while pyres were organized for the Goebbels bodies. As night fell, the groups assigned for the breakout began to assemble. Kempka, leading a contingent that included women and the wounded, prepared to abandon that enclosure turned collective tomb. Upon reaching the surface, Berlin's landscape offered a portrait of devastation: makeshift barricades, lifeless bodies in the streets, and Soviet bonfires illuminating the horizon like torches of an inevitable end. The chaos of the breakout reached its most critical point in the early hours of May 2nd. Around the Admiralty building, Kempka had designated a meeting point, though he offered freedom to those who wished to join other groups. Shortly after, Bormann appeared, accompanied by Naumann, Stumpfegger and Schwegermann, Goebbels' aide. The report Schwegermann delivered was brief. Goebbels and his wife had followed the same fate as Hitler and Eva Braun. There was no time for mourning. The priority was to breach the encirclement, and Bormann demanded an armoured vehicle to serve as a shield. Against all expectations, the metallic roar of several Panzer IV tanks and infantry vehicles became audible in the darkness. The advance began with everyone clinging to the tanks like shadows among the ruins. Kempka walked behind Bormann and Stumpfegger, aware that each step could be his last. In an instant, a flash tore through the flank of the lead armoured vehicle. The explosion threw bodies into the air. Kempka lost consciousness as Stumpfegger fell on top of him. Upon regaining awareness, he found himself amid rubble, disoriented and half-blind from the blast. Groping among the remains of walls, he reached the initial barricade again. His recovered vision allowed him to identify Georg Beetz, one of Hitler's pilots, severely wounded by the same explosion. They supported each other to return to the Admiralty, where a dentist from Blaschke's team was tending to the injured. Despite efforts to save him, Beetz would not survive. Kempka then realized there was no real chance of escaping in large groups. He disbanded his unit and advised everyone to find civilian clothes to try slipping through the Soviet lines separately. Accompanied by a few men, he headed toward Friedrichstrasse station. Crossfire prevented them from reaching Lehrter Bahnhof, so they sought refuge in some tram workshops. There, foreign workers offered them used clothing to conceal their uniforms. Exhausted, Kempka lay down among rusted radiators, hoping to regain strength. The rest was short-lived. A group of Soviet soldiers burst in, celebrating their encounter with the workers. The tension dissolved in seconds thanks to the intervention of a young Yugoslav woman, who introduced Kempka as her husband to a Russian commissar. Amid forced embraces and shouts of victory, he realized his survival now depended as much on chance as on the credulity of his captors. The impromptu celebration with the Soviets dragged on like an absurd scene amid the ruins. The commissar, drunk on triumph, handed out vodka and canned food, insisting on embracing those he called German workers. Kempka, still disguised in tram worker clothing, struggled to maintain his composure as his companions descended from the upper floor to join the forced feast. That brief farce of camaraderie, where life hung on a misinterpreted gesture, drained his last reserves of strength. When the Russians finally left, the group collapsed onto the wooden floor, seeking in light sleep the only possible respite. Upon waking, Kempka understood that survival depended on erasing any trace of the past. He ordered the destruction of all documents, insignia and belongings that could betray them. The flames consumed the remnants of what they had been, soldiers of a collapsed regime. Now, dressed as workers, they were no longer combatants but anonymous fugitives, aware that a large group would not go unnoticed. With regret, he decided to dissolve the unit. Each person had to find their own way out alone. At that very moment, chance brought him face to face again with the Soviet patrol from hours earlier. The commissar, amidst laughter and shouts of victory, dragged him into another impromptu celebration under the tracks. Kempka, forced to toast repeatedly, thought of the charred remains of Hitler and Eva Braun buried near the Chancellery, of the last order fulfilled under enemy fire. That memory weighed heavier than the alcohol he was forced to drink. In a moment of clarity, he compared his situation to passages from Dante he had once read without fully understanding. Now he felt he was walking through his own circle of hell. The young Yugoslav woman who had protected him continued to offer help. It was she who guided him, along with a Hungarian aristocrat, through Soviet checkpoints to reach Tegel. Then she vanished without asking for anything in return, leaving Kempka baffled by a loyalty he could not explain. Weeks later, after swimming across the Elbe and crossing devastated cities, he reached Wittenberg and, with the unexpected help of a German interpreter working for the Allies, obtained documents in his own name. With them, he briefly reunited with his wife in Berchtesgaden, trying to regain strength after the ordeal. But that calm was short-lived. Denounced by someone whose name he never learned, he was arrested by the US Counterintelligence Corps. The detention in Berchtesgaden marked the beginning of a phase that Kempka would recall as an endless journey between prisoner-of-war camps. There began a monotonous and exhausting cycle, repeated interrogations, constant suspicions, and the same questions returning time and again. According to him, the Allied officers seemed incapable of accepting the account that Hitler had died in the bunker. The disappearance of the body fueled the notion that he might have escaped, and with it, the conviction that those who had accompanied him were concealing the truth. In each transfer, the pattern was identical. The interrogation revolved around a single issue: the Führer's fate. The Americans listened to his descriptions of the suicide and subsequent incineration, but pressed on about possible escape routes, available submarines in Bremen, or secret planes prepared to fly abroad. Kempka, weary from the repetition of these theories, responded with what he had witnessed: the burning of the bodies in the Chancellery garden under relentless bombardment. To him, it was incomprehensible that these educated men considered plausible the accounts of sailors or pilots claiming orders to transport the leader to an impossible escape. The psychological pressure was constant. The questions reached absurd extremes: whether Hitler ate breakfast leaning on one leg first, or which hand he used to hold his fork. Kempka understood that these inquiries were not meant to humiliate him, but to reconstruct every detail of a figure who, for the victors, embodied both the enigma and the disaster of Europe. Yet, reliving the end over and over took him back to the moment he poured gasoline on the body of the man he had served for 13 years. In June 1946, his journey led him to Nuremberg. He was transferred without prior notice to the tribunal where the main Nazi leaders were being tried. He was not accused, but his testimony was deemed valuable. He recalls being received courteously by the American officers, even with a certain deference to his rank. For hours he remained in waiting rooms, and then in the main courtroom, where he was sworn in before the session began. For Kempka, the irony of that moment was evident. He, a driver turned essential witness, had to attest to the end of those who had directed everything. The American prosecutor questioned him harshly, surprised that he had been present at so many pivotal moments. Kempka interpreted this as a veiled suspicion of exaggeration, though for him it was merely the consequence of his position alongside the Führer. Many who could have corroborated his account were either dead or in Soviet custody, making his voice one of the few available to reconstruct the final days in Berlin. He spent weeks in the wing designated for witnesses, living alongside former comrades. Some displayed unexpected dignity, while others, once respected, sought to ingratiate themselves with the victors. This contrast led him to reflect on the fragility of human character in times of defeat. On more than one occasion, he recalled the words Hitler had confided to him in 1933, that he would never leave the Chancellery alive. Only then did he grasp the meaning of a phrase that had once seemed a mere eccentricity. After his testimony, he was returned to various internment camps, first in Langwasser, then in Regensburg, and finally in Ludwigsburg, where a severe injury from a transport accident paved the way for his release in 1947. Kempka would later claim he never sought to justify or condemn, but to narrate what he had witnessed. He saw his fate as that of an ordinary man caught in the orbit of a figure who would mark the century, convinced that future generations would deliver the definitive judgment on that time and its protagonists. Erich Kempka's trajectory illustrates the paradoxes of those who orbited the absolute power of the Third Reich. He was a direct witness to Hitler's intimacy and a participant in his end. Yet he never assumed responsibility for the crimes he observed so closely. His memoirs and testimonies positioned him as a key source for reconstructing the final days in the bunker, though they also reveal a perspective oscillating between personal loyalty and denial of any involvement. He was not tried for war crimes and died, like many who knew of the Nazi regime's crimes, without facing consequences for his actions. His later life passed without major upheavals until his death on the 24th of January, 1975, in Freiberg am Neckar at the age of 64, where he was buried in the local cemetery.